Sorry.
Sorry.
So, no problem. And, can you explain these in terms of being adaptive for the species survival? Is this what explains Bach's music or the Rolling Stones? Other qualities that people think are distinctively human, like, for example, caring for people and so on. Duval has argued that at least some of the primates also have these qualities. So, and in psychology, at a higher level, this reductionistic idea is expressed in behaviorism, the idea that all behavior is conditioned. Skinner boldly wrote the book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, arguing 1968, was it, or 71, that we have to drop these concepts. And this is still used in therapy, but it's no longer seen as a complete theory of psychology. And humanistic psychology sort of reacted against this determinism. And they said humans are different from other animals. We have free choice. And as well as that, we really understand ourselves and why we do things. So you've got Carl Rogers therapy arguing that you don't, like a Freudian, use your concepts to understand people. You help just release people's own understanding of themselves. And many people with religious worldviews, including Christianity, this really appeals to this humanistic idea because it seems to give humans dignity. But the problem with this is that people don't fully understand themselves. And should you ask, Billy said, should you ask Nazis why they persecuted and killed Jews and others in the Second World War, they would have self-justification. So that's not an adequate explanation of their own behavior. And positive psychology has shifted this idea to focus on human strength rather than assuming that humans have this godlike qualities of humanistic psychology. And in neuroscience, research is increasingly tightening the link between the brain activity and the mind. Gray talked about some examples of this, and between, for example, neurotransmitters and mood, such as depression. And also, as we all know, especially if we have grandparents with dementia or parents, when people get brain conditions, they change fundamentally, essentially fundamentally different people, either with with dementia or brain injury. There's other aspects of neuroscience that you can stimulate the brain, and this can produce an action. So someone could stimulate my brain and I could reach out towards Nicola. And then what's interesting is that the person attributes it to their own will, to their own action. Confabulation, similar. And some in neuroscience argue that there's no evidence for traditional concepts like soul and spirit, or the idea that the body and soul are separate entities. And some people see this as a direct challenge to a Judeo-Christian account, but it isn't necessarily. The concepts that some people translate as soul, such as nephesh in the Old Testament, I'm not a linguistic expert, but these can be translated in different ways. They don't really mean soul or spirit, and we got those concepts from Greek philosophy. And the final example of this sort of neuroscience area is that brain events correlate with mental and cognitive events. And a lot of people take this to mean that if you see a brain event happening at the same time as a conscious or cognitive event, that means the brain event isn't necessarily the cause. But as you know, correlation doesn't mean causality. And there's interesting ways where you mentioned one example of this, Gray, but where the mental activity can affect the brain. For example, with meditation, this affects brain activity, especially with experienced monks meditating, but also if people have meditated a lot, it affects actually the structure of the brain. And if you don't like monks, well, London taxi drivers with hippocampus in their brain, which sort of provides mapping of the world, it's larger in London taxi drivers. So this is where people's experience and their conscious activity is actually influencing the brain. And placebo effects, where like if people is given, if they're testing a pill for depression and one group is given a placebo pill that has nothing in it of the effective agent, and you tell people, well, this is for your depression. Some people, their depression still improves as a result of the placebo. So this suggests that people's belief is very powerful in influencing, and their depression may decrease, their brain activity may actually change, their brain chemistry as a result of this placebo. So the brain has a lot of plasticity. It's not a fixed organ. And it can be two-way interactions between the mental and the brain. So narrowing the focus a little bit, and I love the way Gray covered this experiment, but and I can just summarize it. But as Gray said, Libe, people had to decide when to move the finger, and what was interesting is that their brain activity, the readiness potential preceded their awareness of moving their finger. So this suggests the conscious will is like hindsight, or it's not the cause of them moving their finger. 1985 experiment, but people are still debating this paradigm, this illustration. There's still research suggesting that maybe intentions do precede brain activity, or that they initiate with the first kind of brain activity. So that's still being debated, that experiment. But it's a useful experiment for setting up a paradigm for testing this question. So moving closer to my own area of social psychology, Nisbet and Wilson in 1977 drew together a whole lot of research in social psychology and other aspects of psychology, showing we make a lot of errors in our accounts of our actions. And we don't realize that some stimulus has affected our action. We may be completely unaware of it. And some advertisers, of course, know about this. But a problem with this research is that it does a limitation of this research, not a problem. It's a problem in their generalization about the implications of that research. The research focuses particularly on some kind of cognitions where we do make a lot of errors, and they don't focus on examples of, and they use retrospective reports, why did we do this? They don't use prospective cognitions such as intentions to test this. And it's useful here to distinguish between intentions. What am I going to do? Am I going to pick up this glass? I might have the intention to pick up this glass, but then if I throw the water at McClure rather than drinking it, people, if that was my intention, was an accident. And if you ask my motive for doing this, I would say, I needed to get rid of the water. Whereas a therapist might say, well, actually, Don doesn't get on Nicola. So in terms of understanding our motives for actions, observers and therapists may be much more accurate than our own explanation of our own motives. So the distinction between intentions, what we're doing, raising the glass or throwing the water, and motives, why I did it, it's a really useful distinction. And other research in this area has focused on automatic processes or unconscious processes. And this is different to Freud's idea of the unconscious. And the most prominent example here uses priming. John Barger's work, he's at Yale now, but he would use this priming paradigm. So he would prime people with words just associated with aging, like Florida, we might say Nelson, or Bay of Tauranga, walking stick, but he wouldn't mention aging. But then people would walk down the corridor to the next experiment, and the people who had been exposed to these words associated with aging walked more slowly down the corridor. So Bard said this is an unconscious effect. It's automatic processing. They're not aware of it, walking more slowly. And And this is perhaps the most controversial finding in psychology at the moment. There have been a lot of non-replications of this finding. In science, as you know, you have to replicate a finding. Lots of different people have to replicate a finding for it to be sound. You know, one person does it, and someone repeats the same experiment, doesn't replicate it. It's questionable. So people are saying, well, the case for these unconscious automatic processes is overstated. I'm just summarizing a lot here. But, so people like Bard were saying, you know, a lot of things we do, our consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg, if you like. And most of our motivation, as Freud argued, is unconscious. It's a different model of the unconscious. And people like Newell and Schenk in London, or Newell's in Australia, Schenk in London, and Magda Osman have argued that people are overstating this case based on the evidence. So finally and more fully, looking at the illusion of free will by Dan Wegner at Harvard. And he moved the argument from automatic processes to controlled processes, which our actions where we're supposed to have some control over our actions, like if we're learning to drive, it's not automatic, we think, move this lever, pull the foot out and so on, and then it becomes automatic later. And Wegner said, well, who controls the controlled processes? Is it a homunculus, like a little person inside the brain or the self? These are not scientific concepts. And he based his argument about how we experience free will. He said it's based on general causal relations, not any special access to the internal causes of our behavior. And so he adapted Michot's theory, which is applying Hume's theory of causality, which of course has been very influential. So he said, what leads us to perceive a cause? And he uses the billiard ball analogy. We infer a cause when there's priority, the cause precedes the event. So if a billiard ball moves before a second, if that one moves first, then that's necessary for us to perceive a cause. If this one moves first, then we won't see that one as the cause. And consistency, it has to be compatible with the event. So if this billiard ball moves that way and this one moves this way, then we won't see it as a cause. And exclusivity, it has to be the only cause. So if this ball moves that ball and not this one, then we'll see this one as the cause. And he cited a paper of mine on causality to make that last argument. And that sort of got me really interested in his idea. And then I thought he's using my idea to say there's no free will. This is not good at all. So anyway, I replied to him and wrote a paper on this to try and clarify what's happening here. So he applied this to free will. And he said, like with intentions, we have a cognition, an intention, and it precedes the action. It's consistent with the action, like if I can throw the water, say at grade time. If I have the thought and then do it, then it's one feature of an intended action. And in law, this proves this proves causality. They try and find a motive for the action. If a person has planned to carry out the crime. And exclusivity, this parameter, if there are other causes, we tend to discount free will. Like, for example, in the lay sphere, if someone's hypnotized and they tell you to do this and you do it, then we attribute the cause to the hypnotist, not to the person. Whereas if a person stands up and walks across the room themselves, we attribute it to them. And the same with obedience. You know, people who often go to courts where they kill people in a war, they say, well, I was just following orders. There was another cause of my action. It wasn't intentional. And Wegner said we can manipulate these causes and create a sense of will, even if the action isn't willed. And he gives the analogy with a magician who, when a magician takes a rabbit out of a hat, what magician does, they conceal the real causal sequence and create an illusory sequence. And he said, Wegener says, with free will, it's similar. He says, the self-perception of free will is no more evidence for free will than our impression that the rabbit comes out of a hat. So, and he illustrated this with sort of a trick that's sometimes used in party games. But he made an experiment out of it where, if you imagine Sue is the person in front of she's facing a mirror, she's in a smock, so the person behind her, Mary, can put her hand through the smock, right? So the hands you see there, I don't know if you can see this on the slide, it's pretty small, but the two hands there, it's not Sue who's in front, it's Mary who's put her hands through the screen. And but so it looks like Sue's hands. And they're given instructions through earphones to raise their hands, the hands go up, lower your hands, the hands go down. And in the first condition, these instructions are given to Mary. And then in the second condition, they're given to both of them, Mary and Sue, these instructions. And in the second condition, Sue, whose hands are not moving at all, she feels more control over the actions, even though the action's actually Mary's. But so it's an illusion, it's a perception of control. That's Mary behind Sue, behind a screen in the little picture on the right, if you can see it. So some problems with this argument is that with this particular experiment, the shift in Sue's control ratings is small. It's statistically significant, but on the 7-point scale, it just goes from 2.46 to 3.0. So it's a very small shift. It's a little bit of an illusion, but it's not much of a threat to free will, and I think. And here's Sue, who's in front. She's not generating her own intention. They're just being told to move. They're hearing these instructions to move action. So it's not a true test of intentionality, I would argue. And there are problems with Wegener's concept of priority. It's true that intentions, like physical causes, they precede outcomes. Like if you intend to get a coffee, your intention will precede your action to get a coffee, just like a physical cause, like the clouds, whatever happening in the clouds will lead to rain. But the one difference from physical causes is that intentions can exist long before the action. Like a person might decide to get married next year and they start planning their wedding. So they plan an action for next year. So all these, and that's different from most, if not all, physical causes. And Wegener's aware of this. And he said, well, that's true, but an action, any action needs an automatic trigger at the time, like a traffic light, you need the trigger of the light going green. But I think that's a very weak defense of this, of his argument dealing with this problem. So this suggests the fact you make an intention for what you'll do in the future, this is different from, you know, a log falling over, breaking a window. And Bune has done other work on this, on causal binding, if anyone's interested. And the problem with the consistency idea that we infer intentions from consistency, and this is true to some extent in court cases where someone shows that they have a motive to kill someone or terrorist act. But intentions often have unintended consequences. Sometimes you do things and it has a consequence completely different from what you intended. And it also applies the other way around. You may have intention to earn money to buy a present, but then someone gives you the money to buy a present. So other causes can fulfill our intentions. And people like Chomsky and Anthony Giddens have pointed this out. In neither of these cases do we infer, when this happens, if our intentions have unintended consequences, we don't suddenly think, oh, we don't have free will because this wasn't intended. We just accept that the causal matrix may operate that way. So that's another problem with implying this sort of Hume-based model to intentionality. And finally on this, with the exclusivity criterion, You know, Wegener had said, well, when there are other causes like hypnosis, we discount people's free will. The problem with this is that it implies people have, events have single causes, and all these events are negatively related. They're alternatives. But just as events in the world can have multiple causes, our actions also have multiple causes, like coming to the conference. You had the goal to come to the conference, but you had to get transport to come to the conference. That's a precondition. You had to have the money to come to the conference, another precondition. You had to still be alive, and many other preconditions. So even common actions have multiple causes. And so many causes may be necessary for an action, but in our explanations, we only pick one. If I said to you, why did you come to the conference? You might give you a goal. Or if I say, how did you come to the conference? You might cite your mode of transport. But the fact that people in the explanations often just give a single cause, that doesn't mean that's the only cause of the event. So we sense free will if we chose to come to the conference, even if other causes are present, like the preconditions. So I don't think that part of Wegener's model works well either. And the error from magic and so on, the fact that we do make errors about our free will, it doesn't mean that our free will is illusory. I'll just skip over that point. And an important aspect of the magic analogy, psychologists are really interested in how magicians fool us, and they do, but humans are also like magicians. We're not just audiences watching the magician. In our everyday life, we are agents, and we also deceive people about our motives, or manipulate people's perception of all sorts of things. So we're not just passive observers of magicians, we're agents. Yeah, and I just disagree with Wegener's argument that control process or free will, they require unacceptable non-scientific concepts. That's not correct. Scripts, action plans, intentions are easy to operationalize. Free will is trickier, but possible. So sorry to just buzz through this, but it's necessary. So is there a good alternative to this sort of model? Well, in terms of our perceptions, some scholars are arguing that cognitions like intentions occur prior to our action, not after. This is still being debated. When we carry out an action, we have proprioceptive sensation. We don't just observe ourselves like in a mirror. Oh, look, I'm moving my arm. That kind of external sensation that psychologists are focused on. We feel ourselves moving muscles and can interrupt it if we wish. And I'll skip Woodward's intervention model of causality. I'll just summarize it. He said with many species, say an apple tree, some critters will like apples, so they'll sit there waiting for the wind to blow to drop apples off the tree, so shake apples off the tree. But humans and apes, perhaps, they don't just sit there under the tree, but they have intentions. They go to the tree and they see the apples, and Cole demonstrated this with apes and bananas. But and we will shake the tree to get an apple off the tree. So this is different from other forms of causality. Doesn't distinguish us from the apes on that particular point. And a useful concept here is self-regulation, which these models explain why we sometimes succeed and sometimes fail to achieve our intentions. We may intend to do something tomorrow, and some of us will achieve our intentions, especially good self-regulation. But some people often don't accomplish their intentions. So, and there's Michelle's very famous marshmallow experiment here, which we don't have time to describe, but sometimes people can't enact their intentions. In lay terms, we're kind of weak-willed, but at other times people can, and some people more than others. It's interesting that gold medal winner, New Zealand gold medal winner, that on the day that she skis, the coach isn't allowed to speak to her. No one can speak to her. She just prepares herself. So perhaps that illustrates this point. But self-regulation is a useful concept. It doesn't assume we can do everything we want. It doesn't assume we can't do anything. It explains why sometimes we can do what we want and sometimes we can't, and there's big individual differences. So how does this have religious or Christian connections? Well, firstly, counter to what humanistic psychology proposes, people often misunderstand themselves, and we often do make mistakes about our behaviour, as Nisbet and Wilson pointed out. But this is not incompatible with at least a Judeo-Christian account. And I've always loved this verse. I just kind of liked it. But the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Some people hate it. No, we're not desperately wicked. We're not desperately wicked. But anyway, it just says this. And then this lovely phrase, who can know it? Well, it's just, to me, if you read heart as mind, as we would express it these days, here there's this expression that, this idea that often we misunderstand our motives. And consistent with self-regulation theory, which shows people often can't fulfill their intentions or goals. Paul, many of his writings are often fine. I don't like or whatever, but he's honest about himself at this point where he says, I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. There's other translations, that which I would do, I cannot do, that lovely, but he's just putting it in there. I just often can't do the things I know I should do. And he's the saintly person, and he's acknowledging this about his own behavior. This very influential person in Christian history. So I would argue that people are not just machines or reflexes. We're at least partly responsible for our actions. And there's also this lovely verse, these kind of writings in John's Gospel. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, whatever that means. It's kind of interesting. So as Polkinghorne put it, unfortunately he died, sadly he died last year, but he was a professor of physics at Cambridge. He's also ordained, and he can bridge these worlds very well. Perhaps I think the best writer in this area. He said, if the reductionists are right, the assertions of the reductionist himself or herself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his or her brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. That cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. And it's interesting that Dan Dennett, who's a philosopher, has also made exactly, I think he's an atheist, I'm not sure, but he made exactly the same criticism of Sam Harris's argument, which Gray talked about. So that particular point doesn't require you to be have Christian belief. You may be an atheist, but also reject this reductionism. So, sorry that's a little long, but yeah, I've sort of said all this. So I think free will, at least in some specific sense of intentionality, it survives this onslaught where we try and convince ourselves we don't have free will. And a few readings that Nicola mentioned.
Right. Thank you
So
so much.
thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. John?